welcome you. Let's get straight to it. Think about every time you read something, a book, an article, even well, what you're reading now. You probably feel like you learn the important stuff better, right? Seems obvious.
It does seem obvious, yeah.
But what if that simple idea hides a whole fascinating world of how our brains actually work when we read?
Exactly. It's easy to assume our brains just naturally gravitate to what matters most. But the process of us selectively paying attention when we read is a really rich area of research. For this deep dive, we're looking closely at a highly influential 1992 paper by Ralph E. Reynolds. It really gets into this whole concept of how we selectively focus, when we're reading.
So our mission here isn't just to say, yep, important stuff sticks. We want to really dig into whether that feeling of paying more attention to what seems important is the real reason we learn it better. What does the research actually tell us about how we interact with text and what our brains decide to prioritize?
That's the core of it. And one of the early promising explanations for this was something called the selective attention strategy, or SAS.
SAS.
Yeah. The initial idea was pretty straightforward. We process text a bit at a surface level, quickly judge what seems important, and then we focus extra mental energy on those parts. That extra focus, the thinking went, is what leads to better learning.
So a nice clean path. If something seems important, we pay more attention to it, and that's why we learn it better. Makes intuitive sense.
Totally.
But as we're about to see, the reality is quite a bit more tangled.
Absolutely. Let's start with the first piece of this puzzle.
Yeah.
How do we even determine what's important when we're reading? It turns out it's not a simple objective decision. It's influenced by a whole mix of things interacting with each other.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that shape what we see as important when we're reading?
Well, first, the text itself is a big player. Think about how it's structured. Are key points emphasized? Is the information packed tightly, or is there more, general description? And then there's figurative language, like metaphors. Take the sentence, "The wall blocked his path." In a prison escape story, that's a literal detail, maybe not super important for the overall theme.
Right. Just a wall.
But in a story about prejudice, that same sentence becomes a powerful, more important metaphor representing an obstacle. The text itself guides what stands out to us. So for you, the listener, the way something is written and the literary devices used can heavily influence what you perceive as key information.
That totally makes sense. The context really directs our focus. What else plays a role?
Then there's you, the reader. Your own background knowledge on a topic significantly affects what you consider important.
Okay.
Imagine a police officer reading a story about a house. They're likely to zoom in on security systems and potential entry points details a real estate agent might skim over, but would be crucial for the officer's understanding. Similarly, if you're really interested in a topic, you'll naturally see certain details as more important. So your existing knowledge and interests act like filters, highlighting specific information as more relevant to you.
So my obsession with, say, vintage synthesizers might make me really focus on the descriptions of music gear in a novel, while someone else might not even notice them as much.
Got it. Exactly.
And what about the situation we're in when we're reading? The specific goal or task?
That's the third major influence. What you're trying to achieve while reading has a huge impact on what you deem important. If you're reading to answer specific questions you were given beforehand, those parts of the text that relate to the answers instantly become high priority. Or if you're asked to read from a specific viewpoint, say, reading about a historical event from the perspective of a factory worker versus a factory owner, that lens will dramatically change what information feels relevant and important.
Yeah.
Even something as simple as being told to focus on learning about colors versus learning about food items in a text will completely flip what you consider important. This means your reading goals act like a spotlight, making certain details shine brighter than others.
So it's not just about some inherent importance of the information itself. These factors, the text, the reader, and the task, all interact and shape what we perceive as key.
Exactly. And this leads to a really interesting idea that Reynolds and others have suggested. Maybe the word importance itself isn't always the best fit. Perhaps salience, something that simply stands out, might be a more accurate way to describe what's happening.
Salience as in what grabs our attention, whether it's actually crucial for understanding the main point or not.
Precisely. Think back to that color versus food item objective. The color of an object might stand out because you're specifically looking for colors, but it doesn't necessarily feel inherently more important than its function.
Right, it just pops.
Yeah, and this idea of salience really helps explain something fascinating, seductive details.
Oh, yeah, like those little tidbits in a historical account that are super interesting, maybe about a person's quirky habits or a dramatic personal story, but don't really help you understand the main historical events.
Exactly. In a study about Horatio Nelson, details about his romantic life or his injuries were highly salient. They grabbed readers' attention.
Hmm.
And the research showed that people actually paid more attention to and remembered these unimportant details better than you might expect. This is hard to explain if we only think about importance.
Yeah.
But if we think about salience, these details just jumped off the page for readers, it makes much more sense. Salience can explain why we remember those juicy but ultimately irrelevant bits. So, be aware that the most interesting parts aren't always the most important for understanding the main point.
Okay, so salience gives us a broader view. Now let's dig into the second part of the original SAS model, attention. How has reading research traditionally looked at attention?
Traditionally, attention in reading research has been seen as having two main parts. How long we focus on something, the duration, which we can measure by how much time someone spends reading a particular section,
Okay, reading time.
and how intensely we're engaged, the intensity, which is often measured indirectly by how quickly someone can react to a second, unrelated task, like responding to a simple tone.
The idea being, if we're really focused on reading and understanding something complex, our mental resources are tied up, and we'll be slower to react to that tone.
Exactly. This is the core idea behind the secondary task method. It's based on the idea that our brain has a limited amount of processing power.
Right.
If we're using a lot of that power to understand a difficult sentence, we'll have less available to quickly respond to a separate stimulus. Slower reaction times suggest we're more intensely focused on the reading.
Makes sense. So longer reading times and slower probe reaction times both mean we're paying more attention.
Right. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The research actually suggests that reading time and probe reaction time might be reflecting different things happening in our brains.
Oh.
Studies have found surprisingly weak links between these two measures when looking at the same parts of text. However, if you look at how consistent each measure is across different parts of a long text, reading time tends to be more stable than probe reaction time.
Huh.
This difference suggests that how long we spend on something and how intensely we're thinking about it might not always go hand in hand. This means that just timing how long you spend on a page might not tell the whole story about how focused you are.
Huh. So we might spend a long time on a sentence because it's dense and we need to reread it, but not necessarily be intensely focused on it the whole time.
That's definitely a possibility. And there's another intriguing finding about attention as we read longer texts. Researchers have noticed that readers tend to speed up as they read further into a long passage. So the duration of attention on each word decreases. However, at the same time, their reaction times to those secondary probes often get slower, suggesting their intensity of attention is actually increasing.
Whoa.
This led to what's called the volume of attention hypothesis.
The idea that maybe we're unconsciously adjusting, reading faster but with more focus, trying to keep the overall amount of learning consistent.
Exactly. For example, early in a text, you might spend, say, 500 milliseconds per word and react to a tone in 200 milliseconds.
Hmm.
Later on, you might be reading at 200 milliseconds per word, but reacting to the tone in 350 milliseconds. It's like we're shifting gears, perhaps becoming more efficient. We're changing how we focus as we get deeper into the material.
So measuring attention precisely is really important, especially when we're talking about these subtle shifts and differences that can be just fractions of a second.
Absolutely. This is why relying on computers to present text and precisely measure reading and reaction times is so crucial. Human observation just isn't sensitive enough to pick up on these tiny but potentially significant differences in how our brains are processing information.
Okay, so we've explored the complexities of what makes something important or salient and the different ways we can think about attention. Now let's put them together. What did the original studies that tried to connect salience and attention to learning actually find? Did the results consistently support that initial SAS model?
This is where the picture becomes less clear-cut. Many of these early studies used a similar method. They'd show people text on a computer, track how long they spent reading, sometimes use that secondary task to measure intensity,
Right.
and they'd manipulate what was salient through things like the text itself, the reader's characteristics, or the task they were given. Then they'd test what people remembered or understood. The SS was generally considered supported if they found that the things that stood out were both learned better and received more attention.
Uh-huh.
However, the way they looked at the data was usually by analyzing learning and attention separately and then seeing if the patterns matched.
And what did these separate analyses show when what stood out was determined by the text itself?
Well, some studies did seem to support the idea. For example, when metaphors were made more salient because of the surrounding context, they were often learned better and people spent more time reading them.
Okay.
Similarly, sentences that were structurally important in a text, meaning they connected to and summarized a lot of other information, tended to be learned better and also received more reading time.
But there were findings that didn't fit that pattern, right?
Exactly. That's a really critical point. Other studies found that metaphors were learned better, but without getting any extra attention. In some cases, people even spent less time reading metaphors that they learned well.
Really? Less time?
Yeah. And then you have the work of Britton and his colleagues who changed what was salient through things like the structure of the text, how difficult it was, and how dense the ideas were, and they found no overall support for the SAS. They concluded that just focusing on what seems salient in the text doesn't fully explain why we learn what we do. So just because a text emphasizes something doesn't automatically mean you'll pay more attention to it in a way that boosts your learning.
That's a pretty big challenge to that original simple idea. What about when what stood out was based on the reader, their own interests or background knowledge?
With reader interest, studies that looked at individual sentences found that sentences people rated as interesting were indeed learned better and received more reading time from children. This seemed to fit the SAS.
Okay, that sounds promising.
However, the results with background knowledge were less straightforward. Police officers did show the predicted pattern. They paid more attention to and learned more about details related to crime. But real estate agents and education students showed more complex patterns, sometimes learning certain things better even if they didn't spend more time on them.
Hmm.
So again, the HAS didn't fully explain how our existing knowledge influences what we learn. Your background can definitely shape what you learn, but not always in the simple way of just paying more attention to it.
So another mixed bag of results. What about the third way things can become salient? Through the specific task we're asked to do while reading.
Here, the support for the SAS was more consistent. Studies that used questions inserted throughout a text found that people learned more and spent more time on the information that was relevant to those questions.
Okay.
Similarly, giving people specific perspectives to read from, like imagining you're a burglar versus a home buyer reading the same description, led to better learning and more attention towards details that fit that perspective.
Right, the burglar home buyer thing.
Yeah, and the same was true for studies where readers were given specific learning goals. In these situations where the task clearly directed their focus, the SAS seemed to hold up better. When you have a clear goal for reading, you tend to focus your attention on the relevant information, which helps you learn it better.
So it seems like the initial idea of selective attention driving learning based on what stands out works in some situations, especially when we have a specific task, but it's not a universal explanation for all types of salience.
Exactly. And this leads to a really important point about how we analyze this kind of research, which was raised by Anderson. He pointed out that looking at learning and attention in separate statistical tests, as was often done, can be misleading.
How so?
Just because something salient leads to both more attention and better learning doesn't automatically mean that the increased attention is causing the better learning.
So the extra attention might just be happening at the same time as the salience in the learning, but it's not actually the reason why we're learning better. It could just be a side effect, an epiphenomenon.
Precisely. Imagine it like this. Salience makes something stand out, and that salience directly leads to better learning. At the same time, that salience also causes us to pay more attention, but the attention itself isn't what's driving the increased learning. To really test if the say is the cause, Anderson argued we needed a different way to analyze the data, something called conceptually driven regression analyses. He laid out 4 specific things we'd need to see in the data to say that attention is truly causing the better learning of salient information. It's not enough for 2 things to just happen together. We need to see if one is actually causing the other.
Okay, what are those 4 crucial things we need to see to show that attention is causing the learning?
First, salience has to positively predict learning. Simple enough.
Right.
Second, salience has to positively predict attention.
Okay.
Third, attention has to positively predict learning.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, and this is the crucial one, when you statistically take away the effect of attention, the relationship between salience and learning should become significantly weaker than it was in the first point.
Got it.
All four of these conditions need to be met to support a causal role for attention.
So if we find that salient stuff is learned better and gets more attention, but that attention doesn't actually cause the better learning, maybe that third condition isn't met or the fourth one doesn't show reduction, then the original SAS model as a causal explanation isn't supported.
Exactly. It suggests that something else might be going on, perhaps salience directly boosting learning, with attention just happening alongside it.
So what happened when researchers started using these more rigorous causal analyses, starting with reader interest and those task-related situations where the earlier studies seemed to show more support for the SAS?
When this type of causal analysis was applied to studies on reader interest, the results were quite surprising. While they confirmed that interesting material was learned better and did grab more attention from children,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't find that attention was actually causing the better learning. And in a study with adults, they even found a negative relationship between what they found interesting and how much attention they paid to it. People actually paid less attention to what they found interesting, even though they learned it better.
Whoa, less attention. That really goes against what the SAS would predict.
It really does. Sometimes when you're really interested in something, your brain might process it more efficiently without needing extra focused attention in the traditional sense.
That's really unexpected. You'd think we'd naturally focus more on what we enjoy reading.
Exactly. It suggests that perhaps when we're highly interested, our brains engage in a different, more efficient kind of processing that doesn't necessarily require more time or intense focus as we typically measure it.
So no support for the asses as a causal explanation when it comes to reader interest. What about those task-related scenarios where the traditional studies looked more promising, like the inserted questions?
Right. The 1982 study by Reynolds and Anderson on inserted questions was a really important one here. When they applied these causal regression analyses to their data with college students, they found support for all four of those conditions we talked about.
Oh,
This was a significant finding. It showed, for the first time, that selective attention driven by the demands of the task, in this case, the implicit task of answering the questions, was indeed a causal factor in why students learn different things from the text. It helped to separate the idea that attention was just happening alongside learning from the idea that it was actually driving the learning in this situation.
hmm.
So when you're reading with a specific goal in mind, focusing your attention on relevant information can directly lead to better learning.
Okay, so the SAS can work causally, at least in some specific situations with adult learners. But we also talked about how learning can differ between more and less successful readers. How does the SAS play out when we look at those differences?
That's a really important next question. If the SAS is a key part of how we learn, then differences in how effectively people use it could help explain why some individuals are better learners than others. So researchers started to look at something called metacognitive ability,
Metacognitive ability.
which is essentially our awareness and control over our own learning processes as a potential factor.
Metacognitive awareness, like knowing when you're understanding something and being able to adjust your learning strategy if you're not.
Precisely. Studies compared more and less successful students in 6th and 10th grade on tasks where what was salient was determined by learning objectives.
Okay.
While the initial analyses often showed the typical SAS pattern, more attention paid to, and better learning of the salient information for both groups, the causal regression analyses told a different story. They didn't find that full causal link between attention and learning in either group of students.
Not even for the more successful ones.
Nope. Even though they paid more attention to and learned more of what they were told was important, the extra attention itself wasn't necessarily causing the increased learning. So even when students try to focus on what they're told is important, that extra effort doesn't automatically guarantee better learning.
So just trying harder to pay attention to what you're told is important doesn't guarantee you're learning it because of that extra attention, even for these students.
Right. This led researchers to dig deeper into what makes more successful readers different. One key idea that emerged was the level of their metacognitive awareness. In one study, students were interviewed about when they realized that the questions they were being asked were all focused on a single category of information.
Ah, like noticing a pattern in the questions.
Exactly. What they found was that the more successful readers recognized this underlying pattern much earlier than their less successful classmates. More successful learners tend to be more aware of the structure and goals of a learning task.
That makes sense. Being aware of the bigger picture or the underlying goal of the task seems like it would give you a significant advantage when it comes to learning.
Exactly. When the researchers then divided the students into smaller groups based on how successful they were and whether they had become aware of the pattern in the questions either before or after a certain point in the study,
Ah,
the causal analyses still didn't show that full causal link between attention and learning in any of these subgroups. However, looking at the data for each individual student revealed some really interesting differences in how they approached the task.
like what?
More successful readers seemed to hold off on really focusing their attention until they were more confident that they understood what was truly important for the task.
Okay, more strategic.
Yeah. Less successful readers, on the other hand, often jumped to a sort of premature default strategy, maybe focusing on things like longer words or proper nouns right from the beginning, even if that wasn't the most helpful approach for actually answering the questions. Less successful learners might jump to a strategy too quickly without fully understanding the task.
So it's not just about noticing what stands out. It's about when and how you strategically focus your attention based on your understanding of the learning goal.
That's a key insight. Based on these findings across different age groups, Reynolds and his colleagues developed a model called levels of metacognitive awareness to describe how the selective attention strategy develops as we become more sophisticated learners.
Walk us through those different levels.
Okay. It starts with task awareness, which they observed in less successful sixth graders. These students know they're supposed to learn the information that seems important based on the task, but they don't really focus their attention in a systematic way that directly helps them learn it better.
Okay.
Then there's strategy awareness, which they saw in more successful sixth graders and less successful 10th graders. Here, what stands out is salience is linked to both learning and attention, but the attention itself doesn't seem to be the direct cause of the learning. It's more like a side effect, that epiphenomenon thing.
Right.
Next is pre-performance awareness, seen in more successful 10th graders. They learn more and pay more attention to what's salient, and attention is linked to learning, but again, not in that full cause and effect way.
Still not causal.
Right. Finally, you have performance awareness, which they believe is characteristic of sophisticated adult readers. This is where that full causal model operates. Attention actively mediates the effect of salience on learning. The selective attention strategy is being used effectively and maturely. As you become a more skilled learner, your ability to strategically focus your attention improves.
So the ability to strategically use selective attention seems to develop as our metacognitive abilities mature.
Precisely. But metacognitive ability isn't the only thing that distinguishes more successful learners. Researchers have also looked at how complex and effective the learning strategies themselves are.
Strategy complexity.
Yeah, they considered things like efficiency, how adaptable they are, and how sophisticated they are.
Strategy complexity. That sounds like how skillfully and effectively we use these learning tactics.
Exactly. Efficiency has to do with how well we use our mental resources. More successful adult readers tend to speed up their reading more as they go through a text while still maintaining their level of learning. This suggests they're becoming more selective about where they focus their attention. They're not wasting energy on less important information. Researchers even developed a way to measure this called the coefficient of strategy efficiency. More efficient learners learn more while using their time and effort wisely.
Like they're fine-tuning their focus as they read. What about adaptability?
Adaptability is about how quickly we can change our strategies when needed. We already saw that successful readers recognize the underlying task of the questions much sooner than less successful readers.
Right.
This quicker understanding allows them to change their approach more effectively. They also developed a way to measure this, the strategy adaptability coefficient, based on how quickly readers recognize the pattern in the questions. Being able to switch gears and adjust your learning approach quickly is a sign of a more skilled learner.
So being able to change your approach when the learning task changes or when your current strategy isn't working is really important. And the last aspect was sophistication.
Yes, sophistication. This refers to how deeply you understand a learning strategy, how easily you can use it, and how it can become more effective over time. To explore this, researchers used some more advanced statistical techniques called univariate and bivariate spectral analysis on data about attention and learning.
Sounds a bit complicated. What do those tell us in simpler terms?
Think of univariate spectral analysis as helping us see patterns in how reading time changes across a text. It can show if more successful readers are using features of the text, like headings or questions, in a different way. For example, if reading time goes up and down in a regular pattern that matches where questions are placed in the text, it suggests the reader is actively adjusting their reading pace around those questions. More sophisticated learners might show clear patterns in how they use text features to guide their reading.
Like they're using those questions as road signs.
Exactly. Bivariate spectral analysis goes a step further by looking at how two things change together over time in this case, attention and learning. It gives us a measure called coherence, which tells us how closely these two fluctuate together.
Okay.
If the selective attention strategy is working well, we'd expect attention to the important parts and learning of those parts to be more closely linked. When attention goes up for something important, learning of that thing should also go up. Think of it like your heart rate and breathing during exercise. They tend to go up and down together.
Got it.
For more sophisticated learners, their focus and their learning are more tightly linked.
Interesting. So more sophisticated learners might show a stronger connection between how they focus their attention as they read and what they end up learning.
That's the idea. And a study using these techniques with college students found that the more successful readers did show different patterns in their reading time. Those wave-like patterns linked to the questions, and their attention and learning became more coherent as they read, compared to less successful readers. Other analyses showed that how sophisticated and adaptable their strategies were predicted how much they learned in one session, and adaptability and efficiency predicted learning in another, even though the learning tasks were different. This really emphasizes how important these aspects of strategy complexity are. Being a strategic learner involves being efficient, adaptable, and sophisticated in how you approach learning tasks.
So it's not just if we use selective attention, but how skillfully we use it that really makes a difference in how well we learn. Now, the outline also mentions the type of attention. We've been talking mostly about the amount, how long, and how intensely we pay attention. What's this about different types of attention?
This is a really interesting shift in how researchers think about attention. Instead of just focusing on how much attention we're giving something, they started to ask what kind of attention we're engaging in. They made a distinction between perceptual attention and conceptual attention.
Perceptual, like focusing on the visual aspects of the words on the page, and conceptual, like focusing on the meaning of those words and how they fit together.
Exactly. Perceptual attention involves processing the surface level features, the letters, the shapes of the words. Tasks like quickly recognizing a word you've seen before mainly tap into this.
Okay.
Conceptual attention, on the other hand, is about processing the meaning, understanding what the words mean and how they relate to each other. Tasks where you recognize a word based on its definition test this type of attention. The idea is that a higher ratio of conceptual attention compared to perceptual attention is probably better for learning. When you read, are you mainly focusing on just seeing the words, or are you really thinking about what they mean?
Because if we're focused on the meaning, we're engaging with the material more deeply.
Precisely. And a study looked at this using that burglar home buyer perspective task with 10th graders.
Right.
After they read a description of a house, they measured both the perceptual and conceptual attention they paid to different parts of the description, some of which were more relevant to the assigned perspective than others.
And what did they find when they looked at the type of attention?
The key finding was that both the more and less successful readers spent more of both types of attention on the parts of the description that were relevant to their assigned perspective. However, the more successful readers showed a significantly higher proportion of conceptual attention compared to perceptual attention on those key salient items.
Oh.
This suggests that the kind of attention they were focusing more on understanding the meaning rather than just processing the words was a crucial factor in why they learned the perspective-relevant information better. This difference in the type of attention seems to be an important piece of the puzzle, possibly working somewhat independently of how much time or effort someone is spending looking at the text. Successful learners not only pay attention to the right things, but they also focus on understanding the meaning of those things.
Wow, this deep dive has definitely shown that the simple idea of paying attention to important stuff is way more complex than it first seems. So bringing it all together, what's the big picture about why we learn important information better, and how does this selective attention strategy fit into it?
Well, it's clear that the initial simple version of the SAS doesn't tell the whole story. While it explains some of what happens, especially when our learning is driven by a specific task and sometimes by our interests, it doesn't fully explain how we learn things that are made salient by the text itself. And the direct cause and effect link between salience, attention, as we traditionally measure it, and learning is really only consistently clear in certain situations, like task-driven learning for adults.
But the idea of selective attention still holds some weight if we consider all these other factors we've discussed.
Absolutely. The research suggests that if we consider the type of attention that balance between processing the words and processing their meaning, the SAS could potentially be a more useful overall explanation.
Interesting.
If readers are able to shift their focus towards understanding the meaning when they encounter important information, they might learn it better without necessarily needing to spend a lot more time or effort on it. This is definitely an area where more research is needed.
So what's a more complete picture of how this SAS might work based on everything we've learned?
A more nuanced model might look like this. Your metacognitive ability influences how you perceive what's salient. That salience then guides your attention, not just in terms of how long and how intensely you focus, but also in terms of the ratio of conceptual to perceptual processing.
The type of attention.
Right. And this multifaceted attention ultimately leads to better learning of that salient information. This assumes a certain level of metacognitive skill, that performance awareness we talked about.
And for those of us who aren't necessarily at that top level of metacognitive awareness yet.
Exactly. The research highlights three key things that seem to separate more successful learners. They have a higher level of metacognitive awareness, they use more complex and effective learning strategies, being more efficient, adaptable, and sophisticated, and they tend to focus more on understanding the meaning of what they read, especially when it seems important.
It sounds like becoming a more effective learner is something we can actively work on and develop.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this research also shows us how complex studying these cognitive processes can be. We need to be aware of the limitations of different ways of measuring things and try to use a variety of methods to get a fuller understanding.
Right.
And it's really important to keep investigating those cause and effect relationships, not just looking at correlations. Techniques that look at how things change over time can also give us valuable insights into how we use learning strategies. Ultimately, understanding how strategies like selective attention work is crucial for helping people learn better, and this research reveals just how intricate and fascinating those processes are.
So you, our listener, as you go about your day and all the reading you do, remember that paying attention is much more than just flipping a mental switch. It's a dynamic interplay of what catches your eye, how you direct your mental energy both in amount and in the kind of thinking you're doing, and your own awareness of how you learn best.
Yeah, what's really striking is how something that feels so natural, focusing on what seems important, is actually underpinned by so many complex cognitive processes. You might be intensely drawn to a particular detail in something you're reading, but not actually be absorbing the core message more effectively.
Right.
Or you might realize that your usual way of reading isn't as helpful as it could be because you're focusing on the wrong things at the wrong time.
Think about those seductive details. We discussed those really interesting but ultimately not crucial facts that can easily pull your focus away from the main point. Or consider how being more aware of whether you tend to focus on just the words themselves or on really understanding their meaning could change how you approach your reading and learning.
We encourage you to reflect on your own reading habits. What makes you pay attention? What kinds of information tend to stick with you? And maybe think about how you could consciously adjust your focus, both how much and what kind, to become a more effective and engaged learner.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We hope this has given you some new insights into the fascinating world of how we learn from what we read.